Monsignor Athanasius Schneider has made a bold and uncompromising decision. He has forbidden the reception of Holy Communion in the hand. This decision has sparked widespread debate in the Catholic Church, with many seeing it as a necessary step to restore the sacredness of the Eucharist. But why did he take such a strong stance? What is the reason behind this prohibition? To understand his decision, we must first examine the history of communion reception and how it has changed over the years. For centuries, the Catholic Church upheld the practice of receiving Holy Communion kneeling and on the tongue. This was seen as a sign of deep reverence for the Eucharist, which Catholics believe to be the real presence of Jesus Christ. However, after the Second Vatican Council, significant changes were introduced in the liturgy, and one of the most controversial was the widespread acceptance of communion in the hand. This change was not part of the Council's official documents, but rather a practice that gradually spread through some parts of the Church. The introduction of the Novus Ordo Mass in 1969 marked a major shift in the way Catholics participated in the liturgy. The Mass was now celebrated facing the people in the vernacular language rather than Latin, and with simplified rituals. Many saw these changes as a way to make the liturgy more accessible and engaging, but others feared that they could lead to a loss of the sense of the sacred. One of the most debated changes was the practice of receiving communion in the hand, which was presented as a way to recover an ancient tradition. However, Monsignor Schneider and many others argue that this change has led to unintended consequences, including a decline in belief in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. The statistics are alarming. According to a Pew Research Center study, 69% of American Catholics believe that communion is merely symbolic and do not recognize it as the actual body of Christ. This decline in faith has been linked to the way the Eucharist is received. When the host is taken in the hand like ordinary bread, some argue that it becomes easy to forget its true significance. Treating the Eucharist with a casual attitude has contributed to a weakening of belief in the real presence. And this is precisely what Monsignor Schneider has sought to combat. Schneider firmly believes that communion in the hand has never been the norm of the Church, but rather an exception that was introduced under special circumstances. He argues that the loss of traditional practices has led to a weakening of faith, and that restoring the practice of receiving communion on the tongue while kneeling is necessary to bring back the sacredness of the sacrament. This conviction led him to take immediate action when he became a bishop in Kazakhstan. One of his first official acts was to issue a decree banning communion in the hand throughout the country. Under his leadership, every church in Kazakhstan was required to distribute communion only on the tongue and to those who received it while kneeling. This decision was not taken lightly. Schneider was fully aware that he would face opposition, particularly from more progressive members of the clergy, who saw communion in the hand as a sign of active participation and maturity among the faithful. However, he stood firm in his belief that true reverence for the Eucharist could only be restored through a return to traditional practices. His decision received strong support from Pope Benedict XVI, who in 2007 officially endorsed the decree, affirming that communion in the hand was never meant to be the universal norm. For Schneider, this is not just a matter of personal preference or liturgical tradition, it is a theological and spiritual necessity. He argues that receiving communion in the hand increases the risk of irreverence and even profanation of the Eucharist. One of his primary concerns is the potential for fragments of the host to be lost or dropped on the ground. According to Catholic teaching, even the smallest particle of the consecrated host contains the full presence of Christ. If these fragments fall and are unknowingly stepped on, it constitutes a serious act of desecration. This is why the Church traditionally emphasized the importance of receiving communion on the tongue, where the risk of losing fragments is greatly reduced. The debate over this issue intensified during the COVID-19 pandemic. Many bishops around the world temporarily suspended communion on the tongue due to concerns over virus transmission. While this was intended as a temporary measure, in some places it became a permanent practice. Supporters of communion in the hand argued that it was the safer and more hygienic option. However, Schneider and other traditionalist clergy disagreed, pointing out that no scientific studies conclusively proved that receiving communion on the tongue was more dangerous than receiving it in the hand. In fact, they argued that the risk of transmitting germs was higher when numerous people touched the Eucharist with their hands. Schneider's stance on this issue has made him a strong advocate for restoring reverence in the liturgy. He frequently speaks about the importance of understanding the sacred nature of the Eucharist and ensuring that it is treated with the utmost respect. He emphasizes that the way Catholics receive communion reflects their faith in the real presence. If the Eucharist is truly the body of Christ, then it should be received in a way that acknowledges its divine significance. To support his position, Schneider often references historical church teachings in the writings of the early church fathers. He notes that while some early Christians did receive communion in the hand, this practice was quickly replaced by the more reverent method of receiving on the tongue. Church figures such as Saint Cyril of Jerusalem emphasized the importance of treating the Eucharist with great care and reverence. Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th century also warned against casual treatment of the Eucharist, reinforcing the tradition of communion on the tongue. Schneider continues to advocate for this cause through public statements, interviews, and conferences. He challenges both priests and laypeople to reflect on the way they approach the Eucharist and to ask themselves whether their actions truly align with their beliefs. He poses an important question: can a person truly believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist while treating it with the same casualness as ordinary food? This question forces Catholics to examine their own faith and how it is expressed in their actions. In many ways, Schneider's battle is not just about communion in the hand. It is about the broader crisis of faith that has affected the Catholic Church in recent decades. He sees the loss of reverence for the Eucharist as a symptom of a deeper spiritual problem, one that requires a return to tradition and a renewed focus on the sacred. His message is clear: respect for the Eucharist is non-negotiable. As the debate over this issue continues, Schneider remains a steadfast voice for tradition. His actions in Kazakhstan serve as an example of how one bishop's conviction can influence an entire nation's approach to the Eucharist. Whether his stance will be adopted more widely in the Church remains to be seen, but one thing is certain: his firm commitment to preserving the sacredness of the Eucharist has left a lasting impact on the Catholic faithful. The decision to ban communion in the hand is not just a matter of liturgical preference, it is a declaration of faith. Schneider's message is a challenge to Catholics everywhere to reflect on their beliefs, to approach the Eucharist with renewed reverence, and to remember that the way they receive Christ in communion is a direct reflection of their faith in his real presence. Whether one agrees or disagrees with his stance, there is no denying the importance of the discussion he has sparked. The Eucharist is the heart of Catholic worship, and how it is received matters deeply.